All right, folks, how are we doing today? It's been good. If you're in the right room, it's October 3rd, 2011. A couple announcements to make, and I'm going to have to read this from my email here. I have a call for volunteers from Joe Kelly at City Planning in Albany. They are doing bike and pedestrian counts in the city at 15 different locations. Count days they've selected are October 24th, 5th, and 6th, twice a day, 7 to 9 in the morning and 3:30 to 5:30 in the afternoon. They are looking for people to take shifts and do bike and pedestrian counts. How many people here have ever tried doing a traffic count of any kind? Here's your chance. Good, we've got experience. I'm going to contact Joe Kelly, Kelly J at ci.albany.ny.us. That's Kelly J at ci.albany.ny.us. If you prefer to use his phone, it's 434-2532, 434-2532, extension 17. They are looking for some students to help out. If you do that, and you want to make that part of your semester project work, that would be certainly something we will take into consideration. Just so you know, the process that they are using in many other cities around the country as part of the National Bicycle and Pedestrian Documentation Project was initiated by my business partner, Michael Jones. The counts come, the process is directly on the outlookplanning.com website, free downloads to communities that want to use it. And it's a very important part of collecting data nationally because the census and the American Community Survey, as you know, don't really get at this kind of level of detail. And that is why we try to create a national-based count program. Cities and regions that take part in that process are data then collected by us when cities share it with us and produced in a variety of national reports that we do to help get that word out into the broader community. So, is there anybody right away who's interested in doing that? Just curious. Okay, good.
Is that K-E-L-L-Y?
K-E-L-L. Sorry. Kelly, K-E-L-L-Y, Joe Kelly. Same office with Katie Bronson, who's the senior planner here. So I will respond back after class and let them know that we are interested. Second thing, and again, I'm just reading these messages. The director of the New York Bicycling Coalition, Brian Kehoe, is leading part of a statewide effort trying to expand on the new complete streets legislation here in New York State. We're going to talk about that today. And will probably join us in class and try to get him to do that next week. Give you a chance to meet our state's top advocate right now. And I'll let you know if we can get that to work out next week. So, current events, and this is a very tough part of my day and a tough part of my life, unfortunately. To put this very simply, the mother-in-law of one of our company's key people, who runs our Boston office, Phil Goff, was struck and killed by a motorist on Saturday morning in the town of Woodstock, Vermont. Our company is trying to deal with that today. It's been a very difficult weekend. Particularly if you can imagine someone who spends every day working on this kind of stuff, to have that happen in your own family is a really difficult, very, very difficult thing to deal with. I had to make a decision. The funeral was about 40 minutes ago, and I thought long and hard about missing class and driving over there today, but for a lot of reasons I think this is the right thing to do. But if it seems like I'm having a tough day, maybe you can understand why, but not nearly as tough as his family has to go through right now. I don't know too much about what happened. I don't think anyone does at this point, except that his mother just went out to walk the dog. Woodstock, Vermont, right on Main Street, if you know Woodstock, right where the covered bridge goes across, he's in the Main Street there. The driver was a 75-year-old male. He did not leave the scene of the accident. He stayed with her, at least as far as we can tell. Very, very difficult news. So not every week we come in here and start class and try to talk about some current events and things that are going on. quite honestly, we've never had to start a class with that happening so close to somebody we know so well. So on behalf of all of us, we certainly offer them our best wishes in a very, very difficult time. Oddly enough, today's session has to do with integrating safety and mobility. It's exactly what we're here to talk about. It's what Phil and our team works on every day, on every project. Obviously not hard enough, because we just can't seem to stop this epidemic of pedestrian motorist crashes happening in our country. As we said earlier in the semester, it's about the same, if you total it up every year. Nationally, it's about the same as 2 jumbo jets going down with everyone on board being killed. And you can guarantee if 2 jumbo jets crashed in this country, there would be an absolute and massive national initiative to keep it from happening again. Every plane crash that happens, every train crash, every bus crash that happens, there's an immediate response, an investigative team that's sent to the site. They even go so far as to reconstruct physically the airplane if they can, the transit vehicle if possible. Every piece is saved, it's documented, studied, to an infinite level of detail. And yet, pretty much every day in New York State, roughly 300 people a year are killed on our streets, and we do nothing like that. We do sort of police investigation of fatality, but no one goes and really reconstructs the scene and tries to figure out what could be done differently, and then applies that across other cases that are happening simultaneously. So, sorry to have to start today on a less than optimistic note, but it is in many ways the right way to start talking about this concept. I think that many of us have been through similar things. I know I've been hit once by a motorist. My father has. We both were lucky enough to walk away in both cases. He was much more injured in his case than I was. Show of hands here, how many people, friend, family, somebody you know, has been hit by a motorist at some point? It's typically about half of almost any group we talk to. And the question becomes, what exactly can we do about it? And I think the answers are out there. And they're out there in why we teach this course. So this is session 5. We have kind of made it through from the big global picture when we started session 1 less than a month ago. We have talked about the sort of general framework in America and some of the differences between how we might plan our public places that other countries are doing differently, how our federal transportation program has certainly made big steps in the last 15 years to change some of that. We now have an extension to our federal transportation funding that will get us through till the spring semester, but no longer than that. The enhancements program that has provided so much of the money for bike and ped projects made it through into that reauthorization, that 6-month extension, and then was attacked again just last week since we met for class. The current attack coming from the Tea Party and Rand Paul, who has decided that, like some of the other members of his party, this is the next thing worth attacking in our sort of cannibalistic form of government that we have right now. Somehow, once again, the enhancements program is the thing that the Tea Party is seizing on. So Rand Paul may very well put an amendment on the floor in the next few days to once again try to kill a program that every time someone tries to kill it, it is supported so widely by people throughout the country. That got us to last week where we talked about the overall major pieces of infrastructure, about greenways and trail. Remember the 4 layers? It's right in your syllabus. Greenways, on-street bike facilities, pedestrian facilities, connections to transit. And what I'd like to do today, before we start talking about traffic calming and safe routes to schools, is actually back up a little bit and go back to the pedestrians from last week. We had mainly because it's just such an interesting topic, I think maybe I talked a little bit more about the greenways and trails and didn't quite give the pedestrians as much time and discussion as we could have, and I think we went through that kind of quickly. So if you'll bear with me for a minute. And in exchange for that today, what I'd like to do, since it's another nice day, is get out and look at a couple things on campus so you can see some of the kinds of treatments that we're talking about and how some of them work. So during our break, we'll get out and do a little field work while we're here. So I'm going to go back to slide 75 for those of you following at home. and we'll talk from there today. So some of this will be a bit of a repeat, but I just want to make sure I've covered some of the basics about pedestrians. And clearly on slide 76, we talked about the guilty party in traffic accidents, and again, that we don't really use in the profession, we don't use the word accidents anymore. There's been a big effort to try to use the term crash or collision. Some people might say there are no accidents. In the very, very rare case, there are things that happen that are accidental and can't be prevented. There's nothing that could have been done. But most of the time, it turns out that when a collision happens, a crash occurs, it's because there was something that could have been done differently. I also mentioned that in many cases, what the officers on the scene and the first responders will document generally tends to be, was it the pedestrian's fault or the motorist's fault, with much less attention being to the physical built environment conditions that may have created that crash. The most common example of that being someone crossing mid-block and the officer writes down they were jaywalking, meaning that they were crossing where there is no crosswalk. And then you could ask the question, well, where was the next nearest crosswalk? And it might be that it's half-mile away. Hard to say that that person should have walked a half mile out of their direction of travel to go find a crosswalk. At some point, the fault lies with an infrastructure we've put down that is not as well designed as it could be for the human beings that are trying to use it. I live in a neighborhood, we'll talk about safe routes to schools in just a minute, where Union Avenue in Saratoga Springs, if I go to cross from my block just to get to the other side of Union Avenue, the nearest crosswalk is more than 1,000 feet away. So if I'm crossing the street at that point, it certainly raises the question if something were to happen, where I should have been. And yet, the engineers would argue the answer to that is to walk to the nearest traffic signal, cross, wait for the light to cross at that marked crossing, and yet no one's going to do that. Human nature being what it is. So, to blame the victims and say that the guilty party in traffic collisions is the pedestrians is sort of an old school way of thinking. And a lot of us have spent a big chunk of our time trying to get people to realize that you have to design around the way human beings actually use public places. You have to think about streets in a way that someone will naturally choose to use them. And that those desire lines, those points of where you want to cross, are where we need to put the crossings whenever possible. There are times where that's not always doable. But even if it means putting crossings in where traditionally engineering was taught not to do it, the problem is with that traditional engineering. The problem is not with the human beings who are trying to cross the street. So, key point. Liability, certainly we talked about briefly last week, and again, just to make the point that you are always in the public works world exposed to liability. You will hear people say over and over and over again, well, we can't do that, it's a liability. I'll go back to the crossing in my neighborhood as a good example. And maybe I need to diagram this for you just a little bit. We could bring this up in Google Earth, but just for today's purposes, I'm left-handed, so bear with me. It's an offset T intersection. Union Avenue in Saratoga Springs. Two T's don't quite line up. This is my street, Clark Street, CL, Court Street, CO. One of the most popular delis in Saratoga Springs is on this corner, okay? That's where all the kids hang out, okay? The second most popular deli in Saratoga is on this corner, 5 Points Market. Spring Street Deli, 5 Points Market, okay? The building that's right here, by the way, is the hub of all the environmental organizations. Many of the regional organizations, Land Trust Alliance, Saratoga Plan, that's their building, okay? Saratoga Racecourse, 50,000 people on a busy summer day, is right about there, okay? If you've been to Saratoga at all. And here, at this end of the street, is Congress Park, okay? Olmsted Park, at least they rumored to be Olmsted Park, I'm not sure which Olmsted designed it, meaning on the other side of that is Broadway, our city's downtown and Main Street. So, needless to say, during the summer, there's a lot of pedestrian traffic in this area. There's a signal here. The next nearest signal, if I were doing this in scale, would be somewhere just off the edge of the blackboard. Okay? So, if you live here, let's say, where I do, I live right there, and you want to go to the Spring Street Deli, anybody want to tell me what direction here? We use a green line. Anybody want to come up and diagram this for me?
What direction you're going to go?
Where would you go? Here, go ahead. Come on. If you were living in my house and you're going to the Spring Street Deli, is right there. How would you get there? Pretty close. Pretty close, right? Would you ever walk all the way down to here, to this crossing? Or would you ever walk all the way down to here, sorry if I'm off the map, to this crossing and this signal? Not even, it might be farther than that.
No.
Probably not, right? Okay. Just about a year ago, and let me just tighten up my own drawing just a slight bit to make this easier to see. The offset T is a little bit more like that, okay? Just to be fair. About 3 years ago, as we were trying to deal with some of our safe routes to schools things, we tried to get our local powers that be to put a crossing in right where you drew it. Okay, because that is where people are going to go. Without really thinking about how they would design this, because it is a design problem to some extent, there was some discussion about where it would go. Now, key point in vehicle and traffic law. If in fact there's a sidewalk here, which there is, sorry about my pen, and there's a sidewalk here, sidewalk here, sidewalk here, there are two kinds of crosswalks by law. There are what are called marked crossings, and there are unmarked crossings. This is an unmarked crossing. This is an unmarked crossing. This is an unmarked crossing. Okay, where a sidewalk lines up across the road to another crosswalk, or to another sidewalk. Okay? This is a signalized crossing, and this one happens to be marked. Okay? Engineers for years have struggled with what to do. At intersections where there's signals and stop signs, most of the traffic engineering world gets that pretty well. But what to do in a place like this? Just, you know, and so their answer has been traditionally, well, the people need to walk all the way down there to cross the street. There's a signal there. And there's another one down here. You know, this is about a little under 5-minute walk. You know, at a child's pace. I'm a little faster than that. But, you know, if you're with a kid, you know, a kid who's going, by the way, the elementary school, right up here. All these kids are bused to that elementary school. It's 6 blocks away. It's actually on, there's another street here I left out. Okay? The elementary school is on this street. There's another block here, and there's a middle school, a private middle school here. There's a preschool there, and there's another preschool there. And so you got the grade school there. So you got 4 schools. This should be safe routes to schools, right? And yet, we're saying that the only marked crossing, by the way, was down here at an unsignalized location. It took a big fight to get all 4 legs of that intersection marked. But they've left this one alone. Well, they didn't quite leave it alone. That would actually be the good part of the story. Saratoga is a bit of a unique beast. These public works people and the public safety people are 2 different agencies. They don't always necessarily talk to each other, 2 different departments. In our strange local government, there are 5 heads of 5 agencies, one of whom is the mayor, one of whom is the public works director, one's the public safety commissioner. Each of those commissioners represents a city council. Really archaic form of government. In any case, they don't talk to each other, not easily, because they're in different departments. So you've got the police department, the public safety department, often governing things like pavement markings, where you've got the public works department responsible for things like sidewalks and curbs. You can imagine trying to get sidewalks, curbs, and pavement markings and signals all done at the same time when it involves completely different functional departments. Okay? And here's an example of what happened. After a request was put in to have that crossing done, there was a curb ramp right about there that didn't quite line up with the curb ramp that was at the intersection. And so what they decided to do was to mark this crossing at an angle across the street, at a very sharp angle. I'm not drawing this exaggerated enough. Which, if you are walking in it, means that once you start walking out this way, you get about halfway across. This is a 4-lane street, by the way. Center line, about there. 2 lanes, 2 lanes, plus parking. Okay, it's a pretty big street, much bigger than it used to be. When it gets down to this end, in front of the racetrack, where there's actually much more car traffic, there are medians and no on-street parking. So you have this beautiful boulevard that opens up into this sort of speedway effect. There's a bit of a refuge island space that's basically the space in between the double line. okay? So you do actually get just about that much room. Not enough room, by the way, if you're pushing a stroller, okay? Nowhere near enough room if you're pushing a stroller. People are really worried about walking across the street with a dog. Because you're standing in the middle of the road, your dog goes out, okay? Anyway, they put this crossing in at this point, and didn't bother to change the parking arrangement. So there are parked cars right up to this, okay, on both sides. Which means you step out in this direction, you're crossing here, you've stepped out right in behind a parked car. Motorists coming down the street can't see you. On this side, it's actually worse. You've stepped out behind a parked car at an angle, and the cars are coming over your shoulder, okay? Didn't do anything about lighting, didn't do anything about yield to pedestrian signs, or anything like that, okay? And so what happened after about a year of that crosswalk being there, people started complaining it wasn't safe, right? I don't feel safe crossing the street there. So what do you think the reaction was? Sorry, Doug, you can't answer this one. What do you think Public Works, public safety people said when people then complained, well, you don't have this crosswalk safe, what?
Take it out.
Took it out. What else could they have done?
Light, I think we put lights across the.
What else?
Yield to pedestrians.
There's pedestrian signs. What else? Keep
Adjusted
going.
the parking, like you said.
Adjusted the parking. Keep going.
Raise crosswalk.
Raise crosswalk possibly, right. Maybe a
Narrow the
median.
street.
Narrow the street. Put in a median.
Put a traffic light.
Unlikely. It's never going to need it. Probably doesn't need a traffic signal at that point. And that's the problem. Engineers have been taught to look for places to put in traffic lights and stop signs. A range of other options. So what they came and just took it out. So after years of citizens wanting this to happen, it gets put in wrong, it's put in poorly by people who didn't really think about what they were doing. The reason it got put in that way originally was because there was a little bit of, not even a curb ramp, but more of a pad in between the street and the sidewalk that lined up with the entrance of the bed and breakfast that was here. Okay? There wasn't a pad on this side of the street, and so they just went to, they lined up the two concrete pads because the traffic safety people were not the public works people, and they couldn't get their two budgets to line up and be able to pay for this curb ramp that they really needed. Okay? It compounded the problem because it took away one of the prime parking spaces in front of this bed and breakfast. Made them a lot less happy about having that there because those are their customers, right? They want people dropped off who are arriving at a beautiful inn to be able to get out and bring their stuff in the front door, right? Very simple stuff. So, sad to say, what it looks like now, it should be a test question for you guys, it now looks like that again. And what people do constantly in this neighborhood is exactly the movement that you talked about, and now they're doing it with absolutely no protection. Now, the way liability works, and that's what prompted this discussion, you have essentially sovereign immunity in New York State, which means that as the government agency, you are immune from the traditional types of liability that an individual might be exposed to, as long as you don't do something that's negligent. And if there is a defect in a public space, you have to be served what's called prior written notice of that defect. And then if something happens, and you knew about the defect and did not respond to it, then you are exposed to liability. Okay? You give up your immunity, if you will, by being negligent. Now, what do you think is going to happen when someone gets hit or injured here?
They're going to sue.
They're going to sue. What do you think is going to happen?
The city will get their engineers to say, there's a sidewalk down the other side, there's a sidewalk up here.
City will try to argue that there are crossings within a reasonable distance. Is the distance reasonable? Would that hold up in court?
They'll have to pay. I mean, because
I think they're going to lose a lot of money.
they-
I think this is a very expensive decision that's going to expose a significant liability, especially because, as it turns out, they were served in writing prior legal notice about this defect on more than one occasion. Yeah.
You mentioned the unmarked crosswalks. Is that a legal
Yes.
standing thing?
Yes, standing
So-
definition in vehicle and traffic law in New York State, marked and unmarked crosswalks are a defined thing. Yes.
So my question then about that is, defining liability, who's at fault and everything, like you said, blaming the victims and stuff. Like, when is it ever okay to hit a pedestrian then in an unmarked?
This is a great question.
I mean, seriously, it's.
I think this is the central question here. When is it ever okay to hit a pedestrian? Now, if we lived in, say, Finland, for example, Sweden, if you ever for any reason, hit a pedestrian with your motor vehicle, you cease to have the right to drive. No matter what happened. There is no fault. You are the person driving the big heavy vehicle. You are the one who hit the pedestrian. Okay? Now, it would be the same in this country if you went and hit somebody with a baseball bat. We take your bat away. If you shot someone with a gun, we take your gun away. Here in this country, it's exactly the opposite. We treat it, as I said earlier, as an accident, not as something that had cause and effect. And the very simple answer in the Scandinavian model is that you should drive as if at any point a child's going to run out in front of your motor vehicle. Okay? Now we'll get into this in traffic calming a little bit and talk about the effect of speed on injuries and fatalities. The slower you drive, the less chance you have of killing somebody. And chances are, if you drive in residential neighborhoods at a speed less than 25 miles an hour, very, very unlikely that could ever happen. So why wouldn't we just design all of our streets at much, to be function at much slower speeds? And that's what traffic calming is all about.
25 or 35?
35, you're starting to run a greater risk. Right around 40 is that point where it gets really dangerous. If you could drive under 20 in residential neighborhoods, you will save yourself. It would be extremely, extremely unlikely. It could happen, you still kill someone, but your chances are much better if not, okay? The simple solution here, quite honestly, was to put in this little concrete pad, which would have cost about $1,200, okay? A little sign that says no parking from here to corner, okay? So there's no parking from here to corner. Cheat this over away from the entrance to the bed and breakfast, so it really lined up right with the sidewalk. Same thing, no parking here to corner. Put in a median refuge at the center, okay? And actually prohibit certain movements that are happening here, because you could turn left to go into this neighborhood. You could turn left to come in here. Put in a full-on, very boldly designed pedestrian crossing with the new yield to pedestrians pavement markings, little triangles in advance. Yield to pedestrian signs at the intersection. Light this thing at night, okay? And make this a very easy to cross the street place. It's an unconventional example, but it does show you kind of what's going on out there in this sort of conventional thinking right now. This is the kind of thing that makes the difference between a couple things. First of all, it makes the difference in whether parents over here will let their kids walk to school. It makes the difference in whether this kid who wants to play at a friend's house over here is going to get driven or not. Okay, this is only 6 blocks from here to the school, which is the only playground in the neighborhood. Okay, it'll make the difference between whether someone walks to this grocery store or not, or deli to get a bite to eat, and the great Indian restaurant that's right next door. It'll make a difference whether someone driving through here in either direction is driving in excess of 25 or 30 miles an hour, which is the local speed limit. Average speed through this section right now is probably pushing 40. Okay? It's exactly what kills people. Okay? And my point of going through this lengthy diagram is more that there are no accidents. Okay? We see conditions like this on our streets. We see them here on this campus. We see them in our neighborhoods. We see them all the time, particularly throughout the United States, but in other parts of the world as well.
Part of the decision not to put all those improvements there had to be cost. I mean, it was probably partly
Right.
lack of knowledge. But
Good
I
point.
mean, aren't we talking about a $15,000 intersection design rather than a $1,000 putting the tape on the road?
Well, are we talking about let's say we are talking about $15,000. I think that's a fair number. First of all, they put it in once. Second of all, they took it out. So you got the cost of installing it wrong and taking it back out. Those are part of that $15,000 tab. I'd argue you spent a few $1,000s each time. So let's say we got the cost down to 10 now, just to be generous. If you did this in a more public way, and this is part of what we talk about with traffic calming, which is part of a community involvement process, instead of just taking your public works crews out there and just doing stuff, I'd be willing to bet in that neighborhood that you'd get neighbors to donate half, if not all, that money. If you really just ask people, here's what we'd like to be able to do. No one wants to see somebody get killed in your own neighborhood. Even if it was, let's say we didn't do that, if you're investing $10,000 in that neighborhood and it saves someone's life and you're not exposed to a significant liability, $10,000 spent versus what could ultimately be a multi-million-dollar lawsuit I neglected one key piece of this just to add insult to injury. And again, I'm just picking on my own neighborhood, but the Saratoga Racino, which is now the casino, the harness track, is somewhere down at the bottom of the page here. If you leave the casino and are told, information, public information wayfinding, how do you get to the interstate from there? You are sent to I-87 from all the way down there through 5 points, a 5-way intersection where the other corner store is, down this street, and then at this point there's an I-87 sign pointing, going east, past the Saratoga racetrack. Okay? So people who leave one facility on a busy summer day, let's say right about noontime when the track is about to open, or a delivery truck or any other vehicle that's trying to get to the interstate highway has been sent right through this intersection and is stuck right here because there's about 50,000 people trying to get to that racetrack. Many of them are pedestrians trying to walk from downtown. So you start to see some of these problems build upon themselves when people don't look down at this level of detail. And that's the real challenge in designing for pedestrians, is that it is the death of 1,000 cuts, quite literally. It is the lots of little things that get missed, not just at one location in a community, but in dozens and dozens of them. And training local public works, traffic safety, engineering staffs to understand the value of every single one of those decisions, and that they do in fact result in things that are life and death, is a very difficult task. And yet if you go to the communities that do it really, really well, I was in Ithaca last week. Ithaca would take this intersection, they would clearly do a road diet on that section of street. Bear in mind that just 2 blocks away, there is a road diet already. And that street has a beautiful tree-lined median on it for half a mile. It just ends in this one particular section because somebody hasn't thought through this particular set of intersections. Ithaca, where they don't meet the warrants, the requirements for stop signs and signals, do traffic calming and do implement other features into the road to slow the streets down to make it easier for pedestrians to cross, and we'll talk about that in a minute. As I mentioned earlier, and this ties into these decisions as well, I think we went very quickly through the Americans with Disabilities Act last week, but really one of the most fundamental bits about good quality design and the idea of universal access, that everyone, according to civil rights law in the United States, not to some policy that's been implemented at some local community level, but civil rights legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act, you do in fact have the right of access to the public domain in this country. It's the reason there's an elevator in this building. It's the reason there are ramps to get onto the podium level of this campus. Maybe not enough of them. Maybe the elevators don't work as well as we'd like them to. But it's also something that applies not just to people in wheelchairs, but to people with a full range of disabilities, both physical and cognitive. And you need to think that that could be any one of us at any given point in your life. I think I mentioned this last week. Roughly 20% of all Americans will suffer a disability at some point. Could be a simple or not so simple sprained ankle. It could be something much more major. It could be temporary. It could be longer term. I would argue that that street that we were just talking about doesn't meet the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act because it is not a place that is accessible in the fullest sense of the word. The ADA applies to the entire built environment. It applies to the interiors of public buildings as well as exterior public space. But there has been a long debate going on as long as I've been involved in this stuff about whether people literally have the right to cross the street. This is sort of where about 10 years or 15 years worth of debate in the regulations that support the Americans with Disabilities Act have been contested, I guess, if you will. I would argue, for lack of a clear answer to that question in 100% terms, that yes, in fact, people do have the right to cross the street, regardless of age, ability, or other concerns. Yes.
Has the American Disabilities Act been used before as as a means by which to push forward a correction of something like this?
Yes, great question. Yes, and one of the interesting things that's out there as you get into this is that there are alliances amongst organizations that can make things happen in some really interesting ways. Worked on a lot of trail projects where some of the biggest advocates have been groups like the Disabled American Veterans. you want to get a group motivated to provide access in your community, talk to the DAV. And these are people that probably deserve our highest respect. And yet, you go back to World War II, people came back from the war in all kinds of disabled conditions, and were basically shunned from our society. Somebody in a wheelchair was not treated as a hero. They should have been, and still should be. As things have progressed, that generation and the ones that have followed it from Vietnam, Korea, the wars that we're in right now, I think have earned a significantly higher level of respect and are a particularly disabled group that seems to command significant attention. They're not alone, they're not the only people out there who certainly should, any planner, any designer, any landscape architect by now certainly knows about the ADA. But what we're not seeing is complete access being designed to retrofit existing communities. I think most new projects are done pretty well. It's been a huge change. I mean, you look at singular changes in the built environment in my lifetime, from every street being curved with no ramps at all, to, I would say, a significant majority of streets being curved. And yet, I would say I live in, Saratoga Springs, one of the theoretically most walkable communities, and in the middle of downtown, there are streets that are still missing sidewalks, there are curb ramps that haven't been put in, there are signals that aren't accessible. You could argue that that's a cost, but in the big scheme of things, these aren't really expensive improvements to be made. And some of it's just, again, that attention to detail, understanding the value of it, and not going to the level that some communities have of waiting to be sued by advocates for the disabled. And that's often what it takes, unfortunately, is legal action to get the law enforced as it should be. But short of that, I would argue that it's something that everything you ever plan or design, this should be thought of from the absolute ground up. And it's universal access, not just access for any one particular group, that everything should be built so that everyone can have access to it. That really should be a pretty basic premise of any part of the built environment. Is there another question about that?
Yeah, so I guess what I was curious about is then is the only, not the only, but is one of the reasons that people don't use the ADA to sort of really push forth these kind of developments is just to not antagonize, if you will, or is it that people don't apply this? It sounds to me like, coming from somebody who grew up in New York City, that you can take this and really reshape, walkability in any community.
Correct.
Why is it not done? What's stopping people from taking this and...
It's a great question. I think it gets to, and I think it's getting done better now than it had been 10 years ago. I think every year probably get a little better at it. I think in the conditions, particularly here in the Northeast, where we're retrofitting an existing built environment that wasn't necessarily built this way to begin with, it's just challenging. Every single street is a design problem, every intersection, getting these details right. To some extent, as the design vocabulary evolved, a very simple example would be that curb ramps should be provided at every 90-degree intersection, 2 ramps per corner. Okay? Yet, 15 years ago, it was thought, well, you can just put diagonal ramps in, 1 ramp, and that way, and that would be fine, it'd be easier to build. Well, on a very small radius curve, that works. But the larger the radius, the more you're just directing people diagonally out into the middle of the intersection. So then what happens if someone's blind and you've put a single curb ramp in and they can't use the curb ramps to tell which way to go? You're basically putting blind people out into the middle of an intersection. Right. Not a good idea. So that has evolved now, and some places have had to go back and retrofit things that they put in place, trying to do the right thing 10, 15 years ago. So there's a cost associated with that. There's a learning curve associated with doing it right, getting the standard details done right, and then retrofitting that into places where you've got to deal with drainage and utilities, and it's complicated. Literally, every corner becomes a little design problem, and to be honest, most communities don't have, or think they don't have the resources to deal with it at that final level of detail. So, with that said, doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it. Tactile, what are called the truncated domes, the little bumps that you see at crossings are required in 99% of the cases now. Making sure that all the treatments that go in for any intersection, anytime people have to cross the street. And yes, I think the comment about have cities use this as an advocacy tool, powerfully. It has become a change agent, and the entire story of how the ADA came about comes from people who are disabled demanding their rights as Americans to have free access to our society. And I think that when you think of this in a global context, even though it took that to happen, it is something that the United States could be seen as a bit of a leader on, in the sense that we have recognized that people with disabilities have the right to exist as full citizens in our society. In many parts of the world, you are still considered a lesser class citizen if you are in a wheelchair, if you've lost an arm and a leg, if your eyesight or other cognitive skills are not the same as everyone else. And people live as shut-ins. They are not given access to their communities. You know, that's just part of the way the world is, unfortunately. There are countries that deny people their rights for all kinds of reasons. So I do think that we have been effective in this country in making that change happen, but it's not something you see 100% done. It's still a tremendous need that's out there. I think the understanding, the intelligence behind why it needs to happen exists, but applying that to the entire built environment is a real challenge. Now, a number of years ago, I had suggested, unsuccessfully, that there be a subchapter B, the ADA Part B, which was for bicycle, that would give people who are using bicycles exactly the same right of access. That didn't quite fly, but you know, not necessarily the worst idea. And again, if you go back to universal access and trying to design so that every environment is accessible, certainly somebody who's got a bicycle with them in a community benefits from those curb ramps. So does someone pushing a stroller, someone in a wheelchair. These things benefit multiple groups, and it's not, again, don't design for the ADA just for people who are disabled. Be a little bit self-centered and selfish maybe, because it could be any one of us on any given day at some point in our lives. And if we're all going to hopefully age gracefully in our communities, this is something that we will benefit from as well. We mentioned the test vehicles last week. Again, this gets back to designing built environment as if you had to deal with it every single day. It always amazes me, some of the bad design conditions you see out there. Was somebody thinking that they have to use that themselves? Again, I think the test vehicle for every street should be a parent, a grandparent pushing a stroller, and you should think of that as your parent pushing your kid. Would you trust them to do that on that street? Is it designed in a way that would make that safe, easy, accessible, user-friendly for your own parent? And in my case, that means a parent who might be 80 years old or thereabouts, and a kid who might be, certainly, under 10 until very recently. You learn a lot when you're pushing a baby stroller around in the built environment, I can tell you. Here's a good thing. Can you push your kid around in your town if they're asleep without waking them up? Okay? Every time you come to a curb ramp that's missing, you run the risk of waking up that sleeping child. Okay? Because you've got to bump them up and over the curb. And so again, there's a really great test if you want to take people out and you don't necessarily want to imagine that someone's in a wheelchair. Imagine you're pushing a sleeping child. And shouldn't you be able to do that in your community, in your neighborhood? Be able to push a sleeping child around in a stroller? Why? That should be one of the great joys of life.
What are you talking about, little bumps? Isn't that going to wake up the kid?
The little bumps now.
No, you go, the strollers will go right,
They go
right down. Don't ask how I know.
I know, I've done this. Do try this at home. Think about that as your test vehicle. I'm going to skip over some of the things, the yield to pedestrian stuff, and I'm going to get us back to traffic calming here. So now I just wanted to backtrack on that because it cannot be said enough how critical the pedestrian issues are to everything we're talking about. It becomes so easy to talk about bike stuff because it's got a certain cachet to it. The bikes attract people who define themselves as bicyclists. Everybody's a pedestrian, and yet nobody's a pedestrian. People don't always think of themselves that way. Yeah?
The crosswalk signals, the length of the walk sign, is there a standard amount of time for that?
Great question. You're a little bit ahead of me, but I'll jump right in there. standard amount of time for people walking across the street. It's got a stopwatch. Right here. Okay.
Just let me get it.
Tell me how fast I'm walking.
Oh, hold on. Dan, come on.
Ready?
You gotta open it up. It's an iPod, bear with me.
It's enough. All right.
And go.
Go. All right. I'm walking at a pretty normal pace right now. I'm strolling. Okay. Stop. How many feet per second was I going?
That was about, well, that was 7 seconds. How many feet is that?
What do you think? Let's say it's 14. It's a nice round number.
14 feet, rather than you're going, so I'll do that math. 7 seconds, 2 feet a second?
Yeah. Okay. Another 2 feet a second. Give me another chance.
All right.
Now I'm gonna switch. I'm in Manhattan now. I got a meeting to get to. All right. Ready? Good. Come on. Oh, you want me to go?
All right. Sorry. Yes, right. Ready? Let me just reset it and go.
I gotta go. I'm late. I got my coffee. I'm drinking Starbucks. Okay, stop.
3 seconds.
3 seconds. Okay, now it says 15 feet.
20 feet. That's,
A little farther that time.
that's we're using 15 feet, right? So 5 feet a second.
Going pretty fast, huh? For years, traffic signals were set much closer to the second one than the first one. And signals were being set at somewhere around 4 feet per second, sometimes 5. In the interest of removing what traffic engineering called impedance from signal cycles, okay? We're going to get to a really complicated signal in just a few minutes I'm going to talk to you about. But the idea was that pedestrians were interference in the system. You know? So you had to try to assume that the pedestrians would walk across the street at the pace I was just walking, which is pretty fast, okay? It's hard
What
for
if
me
you
to...
got a broken leg?
What if it's my mother pushing my kid in a stroller? She just woke up the baby going that fast, right? Not to mention, Mom, God bless you, can't walk that fast anymore, right? There's no 80-year-old that's going to go that fast. They can't go 4 feet per second, right? So now, finally, traffic engineers have adopted a slower speed, about 3.5 feet per second. To me, still too fast. Okay? That first speed I was going was closer to 2. All right? Which means that for every second you're out in the street, or every 10 feet you're out in the street, that's your exposure to being injured or killed, right? And so if the amount of time that you have to cross the street doesn't match the pace at which you're walking, then at some point you're out there in the middle of the signal cycle, and the light has changed, okay? It's not a good place to be for grandma pushing the kid in the stroller. So there's an entire science of traffic signal design. It's way past where this class is trying to get to. But what you do need to be thinking about, again, is the built environment the contributing factor to the concern of safety? Are the crashes and collisions happening because there are certain flaws out there, and I hate to use the phrase, but fatal flaws in the way the built environment has been designed? Now, similar thing, when I worked for New York State DOT a number of years ago, we produced a checklist, an infrastructure checklist for every intersection, using exactly the treatments that were in the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices at the time, including the then speed for, with the signal set at what speed per second people crossing the street. Are the signals visible? Are they functional? Have they been installed at all? Are there audible signals for people who might be deaf? Do we have countdown signals so that people can see how much time they have to cross the street? Have we done what's called a leading pedestrian interval, which means that when the signal changes, pedestrians have a couple seconds to get started before turning movements start to happen for the motorists? A whole list of things. And one of our traffic engineers in the Hudson Valley region said, we don't need that checklist. What do we need that for? Why are we doing this? What a waste of time. So I said, all right, look, maybe I'm overstating the obvious. We don't need this. Let's go out and check 10 intersections, just to see what it looks like, okay? A student who was in this class actually helped out on that project a number of years ago. They went out and checked 10 intersections, found that 6 of them, the signals weren't connected to anything. They weren't wired up. 6 different intersections where, you know, when you stand there and push the button and you think it's not doing anything, it wasn't doing anything, okay? Now people have started to redesign pedestrian push buttons so that just like an elevator button, you push it and it lights up. It responds to you. It tells you that you've actually, how many people have done this? You go to the signal and you push it once, then what do? Push it again, right? How many times do you push it?
20.
20. Okay. Does it do anything? You know, maybe it does, maybe it
False
doesn't.
false sense of security is what it
Yeah.
does.
In a community that does this stuff well, you may even have gotten to the point where there's video detection, infrared, microwave, other technologies that can sense that you're there. Okay? You don't have to push a button. Now, again, signal timing technology and the whole process for doing that is long and complicated. We can do an entire session just on it. But, you know, if you go to the really good places right now, you will get at least a demand responsive signal if it isn't a technology responsive signal. You will get busy intersections that are not timed for pedestrian movements to be the same as the red and green movements. You will get a countdown signal, something that is responsive. It will be fully ADA compliant. You will have enough time in that signal cycle to cross at your mother's pace, you know, and it will be set up exactly that way. Obviously, the challenge of doing that then is how do you manage the time in that intersection for the other things that need to cross the street, which could be buses, cars, trucks, you know, everything. I was going to say planes, trains, and automobiles minus the planes, and minus some of the trains, but even those you have to deal with sometimes. It is a complicated science, but I will say this. If you get it right for the pedestrians in an intersection, everything else works better. It means that the motorists are not worried, hopefully not worried, that they're going to hit someone. Okay? It means that all the movements become predictable. It means that it's less likely that someone is going to run out as a pedestrian because they're frustrated that the signal didn't work. It means people will in fact cross at your intersections because they think it's a better and safer place to cross if they're located properly and they're accessible. So the foundation, as we said earlier in that triangle example, the food pyramid, the transportation pyramid, is to get those 1,000 pedestrian details right throughout your entire community. And this may get us to the point where you can see it's not easy to do. It takes people who really, really understand this at a very bottom level, down to the level of drainage, location of utilities, finely done pavement and concrete details. Now, one of the things about ADA is not having a raised lip in between one surface and another, particularly for someone in a wheelchair, but also for my sleeping kids. You know, you can't have more than a gap, you know, that big. So you've got to then pave your street with a very, very high quality level of detail to avoid those conditions. Getting all those curb ramps right and getting all the things right at all those intersections, again, becomes a challenge too, not an insurmountable one, but it is a challenge. Yes.
Now that we're talking about, you know, sort of that whole those systems and crosswalks, if you go to downtown Albany by the Capitol, they've put in those crosswalks where they'll actually start, you know, they'll beep and they'll give you the that amount of you know, if it'll start like beeping if it's, you know, if you're running at a time, you know, kind of like when it's flashing. Mm-hmm. I find it interesting that some of those it starts like just
the minute you push it.
The minute you push it's like, all right, you gotta get going, come on, move it, move it, move it.
The vast majority of the public don't even know what the different flashing things mean. You know, they're as standardized as this stuff is, a lot of people don't even know. You know, and what the engineer was thinking was that what they don't want you to do is to start across the street after it starts flashing. But then they're also trying to time this thing right, and they're trying to move these cars through, motorists through, and their priority all too often is to move the motorists through. Which is why we then get back to the need to count, to accurately count pedestrian and bicyclist numbers out there, because ultimately the right-of-way on an intersection should be assigned to the mode or the intersection crossing that has the greatest numbers. If that were the case, let's say State Street in front of the Capitol, from the Empire State Plaza to the Capitol, that would be a pedestrian priority crossing. Because there are many, many more pedestrians who are going to cross at that point than motorists are going to drive down the street. But all too often, the right-of-way is just automatically assigned by the engineers so that you end up with that condition. Well, we can't really give this quite enough time because we don't want to slow the motorists up. Anyway.
Question.
Yes?
Doesn't it have everything to do with the level of service for the engineers and how we maybe, you know, rework that so that they have a different way of thinking about how well the intersection is working? And, I mean, isn't it that simple?
In fact, there's a webinar coming up next week with the Association of Pedestrian Bicycle Professionals on multimodal level of service, which is sort of the next generation tool, both to look at intersections and street design. So level of service is no longer the domain of just the motoring public. And the idea being, there's been great work done on this. Florida DOT particularly and others have TRB papers have been published on this. There are new models out there of measuring the idea of level of service in terms of all the modes of travel that use an intersection or a street. And there are great tools available for this right now. Again, like the ADA, you're seeing that get used more now than it would have been a couple of years ago. Hopefully by 5 years from now, you'd expect that that becomes sort of the standard way of doing things. Yes.
We also like, in terms of the time or level of things, if we take the way it's planned a lot of times is for like rush hour when you really do need to push out. Again, it's like, or you got an hour and a half or 2 hours of traffic like that in the morning and the evening. The rest of the time is, you know, the pedestrians are still going back and forth all day, every day.
Yep.
You know, it's not that I mean, you see where I'm going with this. It's like, there's no need to plan for 24 hours of peak traffic. Correct. Unless you're in New York City.
And there's a growing, as you're hearing in these questions, there's a growing shift happening away from the way it has been done, which was largely, you know, the traffic engineering profession in the United States has been pretty much based on moving cars. You know, for decades. This is not something that changes, no profession changes overnight. What's going to change it is you guys here in this class and others who've taken it before you and after you, who will understand that, yeah, absolutely. And things like multimodal level of service came about because people said, we need a better tool for doing this. The tools we have right now aren't good enough. And so they invented better tools. And that's the progression that we'd like to see more of, is to begin to, if there's something that's not working right, fix it. You know, don't just accept it as the only way that it can be done. So that really leads us well into traffic calming, because here's a topic that, you know, by the mid-1990s, somewhat came from out of nowhere, got the profession to start thinking very differently about what's important in communities and neighborhoods, and that, you know, people would say that maybe we've reached the end of the interstate era in this country, that we've kind of done that already. And that the process that led to a country building 40,000 miles of freeways from World War II to the year 2000, which, by the way, generated schools, entire schools of engineering, just to train people to do that. You know, we did that from out of nowhere. In the 1940s, there were no interstates. In the year 2000, there's 40,000 miles of it. We trained an entire profession how to do something, right? So now, what's next is hopefully this. And hopefully you've got a chance to look at the ITE State of the Practice document online. Really, really great series of reports that started more than 15 years ago, looking at this sort of new trend. Very interesting to me, because traffic calming, I think, isn't necessarily new. And particularly here in upstate New York and in New England, it's not at all uncommon to see traffic calming features that are in fact historic. There is an entire generation in American street design that goes back to the 1800s, where monuments were put in the middle of intersections, the middle of public streets. In Saratoga Springs, the Civil War monument that's now in the middle of Congress Park was originally the junction of Congress Street and Broadway, and it had a small traffic circle that surrounded it. In Geneseo, New York, one of my favorites, the bear holding the street lamp. Just Google that if you get a chance. Just Google bear holding street lamp, Geneseo, New York, it'll come right up. Right in the middle of their main street is this 20-foot diameter sandstone fountain with a bear, sandstone bear, holding a street light. And it's been there since the 1800s. Everyone comes into that intersection, completely slows down. You don't need a traffic signal to do that, which means you're saving on energy, because you're not lighting that signal 24 hours a day, every day. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's been in the main street in Geneseo for years and years and years. Most of the small towns throughout upstate New York, and many of the big ones, had features like that as part of their urban design until the interstate era, when all of them were taken out, because we needed the free and uninterrupted flow of motor vehicles. Motor vehicles started going much faster. Motorists driving them started driving much faster, and we were concerned that someone might hit one of these things. An interesting sort of transitional example of that, if you go out to the town of Canajoharie here in the Mohawk Valley, is a traffic signal that's about as tall as I am, that's in a little circle in the middle of the street. It's probably from the 1920s. And it's absolutely charming. I mean, it's one of these things that it's a symbol of the town of Canajoharie. For years, engineers have been trying to have that, and I apologize to the engineers in the room, but really only a traffic engineer would want to take something like that out and replace it with something modern and new, instead of saying, this community loves this, why don't we figure out a way to make it? I realize it doesn't meet modern design standards, but these are the things that people treasure, and there are actually postcards of the traffic light in Canajoharie. You know, I'm not suggesting that just because something old means that it's better, but I am saying that there are
Personality that.
yeah, there's a little bit of personality how we do some stuff. There are a wide variety of those treatments that have existed here throughout this region. So to me, in a lot of ways, traffic calming became a buzzword that captured some of these ideas and maybe made them a little more modern. But I don't want you to think about them as something that are totally brand new. Many of the features we're going to talk about do exist, not just in an historic sense in New York State, but in modern versions of them that are finally being built now. But it was a very interesting transition between, you know, here's this new idea that's emerging in this profession, and at the same time, there are lots of examples of this stuff that are already on the ground and had been here from our predecessors, which is kind of interesting. In fact, at one point while I worked for DOT, we created a sort of photo database before such a term existed of traffic calming features that existed throughout New York State that were linked to each region they were in, so that anytime somebody called and said, oh, you can't possibly put a roundabout in the middle of an intersection on a state-numbered highway in New York State, can't do that. And if that call came in from Rochester, I would quickly email them the photo of a bear holding the street lamp and say, whoever's saying that needs to go over to Geneseo, which is in that region, and take a look. That roundabout has been there for longer, before people called them roundabouts. It wasn't even a term for it. Every one of these features that we're going to talk about, New York's a big state. New York City by itself. If you look long enough and hard enough for just about anything, you will find somebody probably has already done it. And so the idea that this is a totally new thing probably doesn't do it justice. And I do encourage you to think about finding those examples that already exist. And we'll go out on campus in a few minutes and we're going to look at those later today. There are basically a handful of ways to calm traffic. And let me just get back to our definition. Everybody remember the definition of traffic? What's the first word? Pedestrians. Okay? What else? What else is the definition of traffic in New York State? Tell us. How do you define traffic? Anybody? It's last week. Pedestrians, vehicles, bicycles, and other forms of conveyance. Can't remember it exactly myself. Using a public right-of-way for the purposes of travel. It's a general statement about that. I'll get you the exact words. Somebody can look it up in a minute. But it is all forms of travel using the public right-of-way. Traffic calming, then, what that should mean, is calming those things down so they can coexist. Okay? And generally what that is interpreted to be, and rightfully so, is calming the motorized traffic so that streets are more accessible, particularly for pedestrians, but also for bicyclists and others. So generally the term traffic calming, in my opinion, has to do with the changes to the built environment that minimize motorized speeds and volumes to prioritize those streets for pedestrians, bicyclists, and others who are using them. And you can look up, there's 100 different ways to define that term, but simply put, you can just say it's making it easier for pedestrians. Now, fundamental to that is that traffic calming does not mean getting rid of the other things that might travel on public streets. It doesn't mean getting rid of cars. It does mean slowing down motorists, okay? Particularly slowing them down, and to some extent possibly changing where they're going, reducing volumes, okay? It is generally best to think about traffic calming as an area-wide approach, as opposed to traffic calming on a particular street or a particular location. And particularly because we deal with a lot of snow and ice here in this part of the world, there are a lot of treatments you've got to really think very carefully about before they get applied to the built environment of a place like upstate New York or Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, other parts of New England, because we do in fact have to plow most of our streets pretty well. with ever more limited resources. So, this graphic on slide 90 talks about 3 different descriptions: narrowing the street, deflecting or changing the path of the vehicles, motor vehicles, and then sharing the pavement. And these don't necessarily end up as mutually exclusive things. They're complementary. In many cases, you may do all 3 at the same time. But some of the simple things we can do to narrow the street. We talked last week about changing in lane widths. Okay? Not every lane on every street has to be 12 feet wide. That's an interstate highway standard. We're seeing cities go down to 10-foot lanes, which frees up 2 feet of space in every travel lane to do something else with. Motorists cannot tell the difference under 50 miles an hour between a 10-foot lane and an 11-foot lane, between an 11-foot lane and a 12-foot lane. You've got to be driving pretty slow to be able to accurately tell the difference. The one thing motorists will do is drive slower the narrower their lanes get. You can use bike lanes with some of that extra space, and you can argue that bike lanes are therefore a traffic calming feature. The narrower the roadway lanes get, the less crossing distance you have for pedestrians to cross the street. We'll go back to our number of feet that people cross per second. Every foot that you can save is one less step, is one less second that someone is actually crossing that street. Even simple things like adding on-street parking to streets that don't have them functions as a traffic calming device because, again, it slows the travel speed along those corridors. It's important to think about, at the same time that you're doing traffic calming, that you may not at all just decrease the capacity of that street for motor vehicles. You may, in fact, increase capacity because you may be able to move vehicles through that street at a more consistent speed with less starting and stopping if it's closer to the appropriate speed for that road. And if you can make the pedestrian movements more predictable, you're having less interruptions happen that aren't expected. Okay? So don't assume that traffic calming is a negative. We'll get to it again. We're going to get to an example of this before we're done.
So circles may increase capacity over traffic lanes.
And I'm going to, perfect time for me to talk right about that. Deflecting the path of vehicles, the second column here, is looking at, instead of having people just drive straight through everything, what happens if you sort of curve or bend their path? This, by the way, was an important feature in suburban neighborhood design. The whole idea of the sort of curving suburban streets that were largely built in the 1950s and 60s and 70s was so that people wouldn't drive full speed down those streets. Slow your streets down just by design. Very simple thing. Take that to the sort of next level and think about intersections, and you'll learn one of the most important things about not just traffic calming, but how to think about the built environment in a completely different way. So let me talk about, I'll talk about roundabouts in just a couple seconds, but hold that thought. Sharing the pavement, and there's some really interesting work going on, particularly in the Netherlands right now, about shared space. And the idea that in certain conditions, the idea of the traditional European town square, where there are no signals, no traffic controls whatsoever, and everyone just shares that space. And then human beings figure out how to do this without devices to do it, but maybe with just a very common surface that's used, very much pavers, for example, streets that, or public squares that can be used for markets at certain times of the year. Sometimes are just shared people walking and driving in the same space. Traffic calm streets, curbless streets, which have become very common now. Instead of separating the pedestrians vertically, making the street one level, but designing it so it looks like a place that people should be walking very slowly. Those kinds of streets only work where the motorists are traveling at less than 15 miles an hour. Okay? And that's a difficult thing to do because in a lot of communities in the United States and a lot of states, you're not allowed to design roads that slow yet. Big push for 20-mile-an-hour streets. There's been attempts in our legislature to change that. There are certain areas in New York City that now are allowed to design 20-mile-an-hour streets. The only place we're allowed to do it now in the rest of the state is school zones, where we are allowed to create 15-mile-an-hour streets, but very rarely do. Usually all we do is put a sign up that says school zone 15 miles an hour and expect people are going to follow the law. Well said. So again, sharing the pavement, designing a shared space, going backwards now, changing the path of the vehicles, we'll get into roundabouts in a minute, and narrowing the street. There's sort of 3 general types. There are an infinite number of treatments. Deflecting the path of the vehicles may not just be laterally, may also be vertically. And it's funny, one of the places that we're most commonly seeing what are called raised intersections or speed tables is airports. I did a report for the National Bike and Pedestrian Clearinghouse a number of years ago with the APBP, looking at innovative uses of traffic treatments. And as airports, this is going to be the place where speed tables make so much sense. And at that time, there were only a handful in the country. Reno Lake Tahoe was one of the very first. Baltimore Washington Airport basically took the curbs coming out of the baggage claim area, lined them up with their parking areas, and kept the sidewalk level, which then meant you had to ramp up and over it from the motorist's perspective. Motorists had to slow down, come up and over that ramp. But if you're pulling a wheeled suitcase, you didn't have to go down into the street, cross, and come back up. Just turn that whole idea around, okay? The vast majority of major airports now have done that. It's interesting how many airports now have that treatment. Makes total sense, right? And so you see a lot of streets doing the same thing. Speed tables like that come in a million different varieties and treatments. We'll see some very good new ones that were just in here that are parabolically topped, big enough that a school bus or an ambulance can go over the top of it without having to jar its occupants. A big difference from what used to be called speed bumps, which were very small, maybe 2 feet long, and enough that if you owned a suspension repair shop in town, you could make a lot of money because you were bouncing over this. I've been lucky enough to travel quite a bit in Mexico, and the what they call topes. Anybody here been to Mexico? You know topes, okay? Or ropes, which I love. Literally, you go to a lot of small towns in Mexico where there are dirt roads, and a big piece of rope is just pulled across the street. And you drive over these ropes. It slows you down, let me tell you. You hit that piece of rope, it's as good as any other traffic hump. Topes are much more raised steel bumps. And if you travel, say, the federal highway in the Yucatan, going from Cancun to the south, every time you come into a town center, this is on a major state highway, the same as our numbered state highway system here, you will come through a section of topes. You will absolutely slow down to 10 miles an hour. You will go through that area, and then you'll be able to speed up after you've left the center of town. We're not quite that aggressive here with our traffic calming, but as you look around the world at those solutions, they range from pieces of rope to the speed tables to go out and look at. So again, vertical changes in the streetscape, so that motorists have to go up and over things. Horizontal changes, so people that have to turn, both are types of deflection, changing the path that motorists have to try to get through, and certainly narrowing the street. And again, it can be street trees, one of my all-time favorites. Just perceptually narrowing the street. It's amazing how effective street trees are for 100 different things, including calming traffic, because when you drive through the classic tunnel effect of a great New England road, even rural roads or main streets benefit from that enclosure. It makes you feel like you should be driving slower. It's not too often that I hear many other people suggest this, but planting street trees is a great traffic calming treatment. Narrowing the pavement by changing the lane dimensions, adding bike lanes, in some cases coloring those bike lanes to really make the street look different.
As opposed to just put a little bicycle sign with arrows.
Right, as opposed to just, Washington Avenue, a good example, just putting some shared lane markings in may or may not be enough. But the built version of those changes at intersections are what are called bulbs or neck downs, where the pedestrian space actually is narrowed out into the street. And again, a good example of that, dealing with our climate issues here, our snow removal issues, we worked with a couple small towns in the Mohawk Valley here. Fort Plain was one of them when traffic calming was being treated as a new thing. And of course, all the snowplow drivers said, well, we're going to hit these things. You start bringing the curbs out to narrow the intersections down, we're going to be plowing that parking lane, we're going to smack into that with our plows. So we actually then worked with the snowplow drivers and said, what dimension would you feel comfortable with? And what they said was, don't, in their climate, don't build the curb extensions all the way out to the edge of the travel lane, keep them back. So instead of your parking lanes are 8 feet, make the curb extension 6 feet. So 2 meters instead of 2.5. It was enough for them to say, that way we'll know when we're plowing a travel lane, we're not going to hit it. And we know that when we're plowing a parking lane, we'll be able to merge out without doing that because we'll see where the curbs are. Simple idea, right? And so if you go out to Fort Plain, just a few miles from here, you can see that treatment done, and that became a design standard in that region. There is often a perceived conflict with traffic calming, with emergency services, with first responders, with fire departments and ambulances. Again, all this has been done and dealt with and challenged and solved, including the 2-meter dimension for the curb extensions and the flatter top speed tables so that areas around hospitals probably are not your first choice for traffic calming. On the other hand, many of them are in busy urban neighborhoods and there are people needing to get in and out of those hospitals that may not be driving. And the last thing you want is a speeding vehicle hurting someone at a hospital. So there are areas in that vicinity, and again, design according to the context that you're in. Make sure that if you're doing a traffic calming project, you have thought about the effect on an entire neighborhood or area, because you don't want to just do traffic calming on one street and then people shift the street over and drive twice as fast there. You want to make sure that you're thinking about this a little systematically. So don't just do one thing. Don't just use one type of traffic calming device or treatment. Think area-wide and think about the wide ranges of choice you have. So again, like good pedestrian design, this becomes something you've really got to think across multiple ideas at the same time. You've got to be thinking about multiple kinds of traffic that are moving at the same time. And so it's difficult in a lot of communities to implement these kinds of programs because it takes a different way of looking at the built environment to really make it work. And yet, you look at slide 91, who's our customers? And who's out there that you're trying to provide that level of service for? These are two of my favorite kids. I was working on a project in Durham, North Carolina, and these two kids were just, you're just out doing field work one day and looking at a particular neighborhood. Boy, they were so happy. They're out there, they're riding their bikes to school, and we had to ask their parents, is it okay to talk to them and all that. But they just, this is how we want to get to school. We want to grow up, I want the independence of riding my bike. So, this is who we want to be able to provide communities for and communities with. If we haven't been able to get them safely to school, we haven't done our job well. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about complete streets in this context because it's hard to separate out the two. There are lots of sort of niches within the built environment realm that are out there right now, and complete streets has become one of the biggest ones. To me, traffic calming and the idea of complete streets are somewhat inseparable. I think of the two as, in many ways, not synonymous, but certainly parallel. The idea of complete streets is that every street that gets built should include the appropriate design for everything it needs to move on it. Very simply put. That we should not be designing monomodal car and truck motorist-only streets, but that we should be assuming, unless there is some absolute prohibition, which does exist on certain roads, but even those roads people need to get across. In most states you're not allowed to ride a bike or walk on the interstate highway, but in every state you need to get across that interstate highway if you're a pedestrian or a bicyclist. Maybe not physically on it, but over or under it. Yes?
The Cross Bronx Expressway?
Cross Bronx Expressway, great example. At some point, if you live on one side of the Cross Bronx Expressway and you're going to a place on the other side of it, you need to get over, under, or somehow to the other side. Otherwise, you've just built a giant wall through your community. And many people would argue that's exactly what the Cross Bronx Expressway is. Built in the Robert Moses era, where it was just, who cares? We're just going to build this huge thing right through here. And we really, quite honestly, don't care that much about the people on either side. 787 here between the Hudson River and downtown Albany, perfectly good example. My point being that even a road like 787 or the Cross Bronx has a pedestrian and bicyclist component, even if it's not necessarily on it, but perpendicular to it. Many of the interstates, by the way, have paths built within their right-of-way. Again, 787 here in Albany is a very good example. The Hudson Mohawk Bikeway is in interstate highway right-of-way. The I-90 Patroon Creek Greenway hopefully will be as well. So again, even the roads where bikes and pedestrians are currently prohibited should not be excluded from the discussion of complete streets. But for most cases, people are thinking about complete streets in an urban context of places where multiple types of transportation and mobility are sharing that common right-of-way. It applies equally, though, I'd add, to rural roads. And again, we can talk about sort of rural complete streets and rural traffic calming as well. And again, it's things as simple as changing the lane dimensions, putting in paved shoulders, tree-lined roads. All these things may be appropriate in some way, shape, or form. And it really, ultimately to me, it says that every street needs to be complete. If you want to study a great profile of someone who's made tremendous change in this country, almost single-handedly, Barbara McCann. Barbara started the whole idea of complete streets, figured out that what we needed was a better buzzword and a better catchphrase for what many people were trying to do. Initially, there were attempts, as I mentioned, the last couple transportation bills to integrate all modes of transportation into the legislation. And the term that was more often being used 10 years ago was routine accommodations. That was we weren't very good at buzzwords as a profession, what can I say? And routine accommodations, people are trying to get that routine accommodations language into federal transportation policy and law, and really didn't get very far in seeing that happen. At the same time, in 1999, the U.S. Department of Transportation did issue a routine accommodations policy, saying that it was the U.S. DOT's policy to include facilities for bicyclists and pedestrians in all projects unless there were certain exceptions. And those exceptions were if bicyclists and pedestrians were prohibited from using the facility, if excess cost would be required more than 20% of the value of the project to make that accommodation happen, or if there was no future projection that would show any need for pedestrians and bicyclists to use that facility. So in general, going back more than a decade ago, the feds had made that statement. At the same time, Congress didn't, and that exact same language did not make it into the last couple of transportation bills. And so Barbara McCann and others decided to form a new coalition, create a new term, and start writing new forms of policy for complete streets. And so the Complete Streets Coalition was created. Barbara is just one of these people who's just she's a great thinker, and probably came up with something bigger than even she thought would be successful. New York State just adopted Complete Streets legislation here and has just been signed by the governor. That would never have happened if Barbara and her crew of folks had not pushed this idea forward at the national level. And really what the Complete Streets Coalition has tried to do is not just push for this to end up in federal transportation legislation, but to get states and counties and other municipalities, local communities to adopt their own policies. Not everything has to come from Washington, right? So one of our initiatives here, working with Barbara and others very early on in this, going back to the year 2002, so about 9 years ago, through the Initiative for Healthy Infrastructure here at Albany, we drafted, along with the New York Planning Federation, the Department of State, and other partners, a set of guidelines for complete streets and safe routes to schools policies here in New York State. We made that a free download to anybody who wanted to use them, and basically wrote out for a village, county, a town, which are three different forms of government here in New York State, for villages, counties, or towns, exactly what the complete streets or safe routes to schools policies could say. Figure make it very easy. All people have to do is download it and go get it adopted, right? Needless to say, not so easy, because nothing's ever that easy. But we did have some really great successes early on. Buffalo in Erie County, a guy named Justin Booth, Green Options Buffalo, did an amazing job of getting Buffalo's Common Council to adopt the first big city complete streets policy in the eastern United States, Buffalo. Nobody expected Buffalo to be able to do that. Binghamton did the same thing. Dozens of communities in New York State adopted those policies. And I mentioned the Buffalo story because it came up at a public forum Doug was speaking at the other night for Sustainable Saratoga. And somebody asked me what's the difference between a good policy and a not so good policy, because there are plenty of policies that have been adopted. And needless to say, nobody just adopts them right out of the guidelines. That would be way too easy. Well, it happened with Buffalo's case. I was here in my office at the university, and I get a call from Justin. We used the model policy. Buffalo was ready to adopt it. And that day, I get an email and a call from Justin. Can you look at the policy before they vote on it? And I thought it was just a routine thing to look at. And Barbara and everybody else will tell you that their policy has to say that we shall include the appropriate facilities on all streets. Buffalo had changed all the shalls to shoulds. thinking it didn't really matter that much, and that would give them some wiggle room, if nothing else, that we should include the right thing on every street. And it must have said that 6 different times in the document. So I took out my digital red pen and changed all the shoulds back to shall, called Justin and said, you can't let them make this change. And of course, needless to say, somebody in that council was trying to dumb down what was going to be voted on. So we decided that this actually worked. We said, you've got to tell them that if they change it today, it has to go back and get recirculated to all the council members, and it'll delay the thing a month. They won't be able to vote on it. We didn't even know if that was procedurally accurate or not, but it worked. And it kept them, they went back to the previous version, and they adopted a policy that said shall. So Buffalo's policy is a requirement that this is the way they will do business. Interestingly enough, just a few months later, Erie County, which Buffalo is in, adopted the same policy. So both Buffalo and Erie County have a very strongly worded, we shall integrate our streets policy adopted by vote of their council. So that is, to some extent, binding. Requires a tremendous amount of advocacy to follow every project through, to make sure that just because you have something in policy, we just talked about this with the Americans with Disabilities Act, in that case you've got something in civil rights legislation that isn't being followed all the time. So, you know, a common council policy doesn't carry quite the same weight. But Buffalo, we worked on this with them, did a complete streets plan for the city. They have implemented their first couple of complete streets projects as a result. Put in their first bike lanes, road diets, and some of the other treatments that they're doing. It took until this year, though, for New York State to adopt a complete streets law. And some of you might be asking yourselves, I hope, well, why would it take so long? Okay. I'll give you the short version of the story, and Brian Keogh will hopefully come in next week and talk more about it. I would say it took so long because, how do I say this politely? I'm not the only one who said that what goes on here at our Capitol is not the most functional form of legislative body in the United States. New York State has had a whole lot else on its mind. We've gone through a couple of governors recently, some of them not in the most glorious of circumstances. Some changes in leadership that were somewhat unexpected, let's say. And so it's very hard to get anything on the radar downtown. Not an easy state to get any legislation passed in. So the idea of doing something that was new and progressive and didn't have a whole lot of advocacy force behind it. The New York Bicycling Coalition that Brian is director of has been a relatively small voice in Albany, has not been the kind of powerhouse that you might find in, say, the Vermont Bike Coalition or Mass Bike or some of the other counterparts, Chicagoland Bike Federation, Transportation Alternatives in New York City, are very, very strong organizations that are very well politically wired in. And so there just wasn't that much of a push. Then a few years ago, another group that probably no one thought of as a huge complete streets advocate started catching on to this at the national level, and it was the AARP. I'm a proud member here, I'm old enough to say that now. But not certainly somebody thought would get involved in transportation policy advocacy. And the American Association of Retired People got involved in this at a national level because they saw this, that their members were the grandparents pushing the strollers across the street, and that this was a way for them to advocate for something that their membership really believed in. And so here in New York State, Will Farris and his team at the AARP actually took the lead in trying to get a complete streets bill passed. And it's a pretty extraordinary set of circumstances. They certainly worked with the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, New York Bicycle Coalition. They got the health departments involved and started having tremendous support from the Department of Health because this was seen as a health and safety issue. I need to say with some caution, because many of them are my good friends, but the Department of Transportation was not a leader in getting this done, and in fact in many ways opposed the adoption of this legislation. This is the same agency that for 7 years in a row opposed changing the yield of pedestrians law in New York State to make it clearer. And finally, after 7 years, that finally got done. I wish that weren't the case, but that's probably been true of a lot of the DOTs, both at the local levels. It was perceived by many transportation agencies at a time of difficult budgets, and you're seeing the same comments come in Congress. Well, this is going to be an extra cost. This is going to take more money, more resources. We can barely do what we're doing right now. And again, that's not always true. It's an issue that if you communicate it well, is an important one. Very often, complete streets are not at all more costly. Most of what can be done better, faster, and cheaper if it's integrated into the projects that you're doing instead of waiting until after the fact and retrofitting them. If you're building a bridge, chances are putting a paved shoulder on that bridge is something that is much, much easier done now than it will ever be later on. And we build our bridges for a 50-year lifespan. If you don't get it done right now, you're not going to get another chance to come back and fix it. Most roads, as I've said, have excess pavement capacity. Kind of joke about the idea of the Roads and Trails Conservancy, but all those 12-foot lanes out there can be repurposed just with changing the striping plan. Arlington, Virginia, when they first started their bike program, our friend and colleague Charlie Denny got more than 20 miles of bike lanes done in Arlington just by getting inside their pavement program and working with folks who were doing the striping plans, repaving existing streets every year and just changing the stripes around. Miles and miles of new bike lanes done at no cost, just by moving the stripes. Yeah.
How wide is the bike lane recommended? You know, how wide?
Bike lanes width typically 5 feet, optimally 2 meters, but no wider. Anybody want to say why? Why would you not want a bike lane a whole lot wider? Sure, people start driving it. So it's a fine line. Portland has gone to widening the edge stripe between the bike lane and the motorist and going to a 2 meter width, roughly 6 feet, because at least that way 2 adult cyclists can pedal side by side or someone can pass another cyclist. But you've really got to start to get pretty aggressive in terms of narrowing your lane widths and making your other improvements to be able to do that. Sometimes you're battling for inches on these street projects. So in a general sense, complete streets, because of the new New York State law, this is kind of major news right now. I mentioned Brian's going to come in and talk about some of that. But there were some of us out doing complete streets trainings around New York State a decade ago. Yes?
Having a complete street policy, could that possibly make you more, if you're going to apply for a grant, make your grant application a little bit stronger to have a policy and then have the buzzwords in there? We're working with a couple of communities that are a little more rural, and they've been trying to do a lot of this stuff without having the buzzwords in the policy, and they've been applying for grants and haven't been successful. And I think that having a policy will do that. Is that something?
It's a good point, just to repeat it a little louder, is that in some cases there are grant fund sources now for everything from the HUD Sustainability Program or the Department of Health and Human Services nationally, even transportation money that's coming out, where they're saying one of the conditions of getting these kinds of funds is demonstrating that you have support. We'll talk about that with Safe Routes to Schools as an example, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. You can't get Safe Routes to Schools money unless you've adopted a positive policy for kids walking and bicycling to school in your community. So some of these policies are being held hostage, if you will, by grant agencies wanting to see those kinds of policy changes happen, because to some extent the enacting of a policy doesn't really cost you anything other than being organized as a community. The cost, if there is any, is in then integrating the process that you use. But I do not believe that complete streets in any way should be seen as an extra cost. I think it should be seen as a cost savings. It is the most effective way to improve the public right-of-way for everyone who needs to use them, and to comply with things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the needs for the full range of mobility to make our communities safer, and not have to do this by retrofitting programs later on. It is so much more costly to come back and have to do standalone projects to fix these kind of problems than it is to fix them incrementally as an integrated way of doing business. So while a lot of this started with sort of a do this for bikes and pedestrians approach, the earlier versions of routine accommodations, the buzzword of complete streets has really hit home. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples. You can go to the Complete Streets website and find all these communities that have adopted policies. They've morphed into hundreds of versions of the same thing. But ultimately, the biggest difference between a good policy and a not so good policy, the really good ones are shall. This is what we will do. It is our policy to do this. It's not our policy to consider it. It's not our policy to say we should do it, or we might do it, or we could do it. It is our policy that we will do it. So let's talk about safe routes to schools on slide 93. By the way, any one of these topics, we could spend an entire month of talking about and working on. I wish we could, but we've only got a few hours each week for this class, and I'll try to touch on them in the detail that we can. I would argue that safe routes to schools is one of the most significant trends in my lifetime of changing the opportunity for making change in terms of transportation. We went from a country, when I was in grade school, that about 60% of kids walked and bike to school nationally, to a country now where we're closer to 16 than we are to 60. The vast majority of kids now no longer walk or bike to school. An increasing number of them are being driven more than they're being bused. They're being driven by their parents or caregivers than they're even riding the school bus. I think if you really look carefully at a lot of school districts, you're seeing buses that are being driven around empty. We're very often required to provide that school busing, even if it's not being used. High schools in America are a great example of this. And the outcome of that is we're expanding our parking lots, we're spending huge amounts of money on new drop-off zones, big investments in more and more motoring to school. While at the same time, and Melissa and the other health experts will tell you, our kids are less and less physically active, they're spending less and less time outdoors. They're not getting the skills of independence and understanding geography, social skills, and other skills that you get by taking yourself to school. And that's a real loss. It's a loss we are not going to be able to recapture in the generation that grew up without it. Many of whom, I think unfortunately, you're all sitting here in the room today. How many folks here today walk or bike to school regularly? Not nearly enough, okay? We're probably in the under 30% range here in this room. And then we have to change that. We can't change that at the level of our schools. And again, take this back to the time of my childhood. That change did happen to the generation I'm part of. We did walk and bike to school. We did become a generation that doesn't. That was done because of changes in the built environment that made it more difficult to do. We located schools in places where land was cheap on the belief that we needed to provide schools with more green space and do some things that were good ideas, playing fields and all kinds of requirements about the amount of land the school would need, which made us essentially abandon the idea of building neighborhood-scaled schools in our communities. The schools moved farther and farther out, more often than not, the cheap land, where it was easy to build that bigger school on all that property, but then you had to bus everybody to school. Okay, that is such a common trend. Our state-numbered highways in New York State are full of new school sites all over the state. Okay? So that was a land use decision, a planning decision that probably had as much impact on the future of these children as any other, and it was rarely, if at all, considered what would it mean if none of these kids walked or biked to school. You combine that with the sort of fear factor that exists in our society and the idea that we can control our kids better. By the way, anybody who's ever ridden a school bus and thinks we can control our kids better by putting them on a school bus, I'm not so sure that idea holds water at all. The behavioral problems on school buses are their own sub-lecture if we ever want to get into it, and a trend that I don't think anyone's studied enough, the hatred of buses that has come out of that from so many kids who don't want to be seen on the yellow school bus, don't like the yellow school bus, are getting bullied on the yellow school bus, don't want to spend that much time every day sitting on the bus. We've created a generation that doesn't like mass transit either, okay? And expect to be driven and chauffeured everywhere. The whole phenomenon of soccer moms and dads, the idea that we now drive, children just get driven everywhere they have to go. This is not across the board true of every school district everywhere in the United States. Certainly kids in New York City more often use the transit system or walk, in some cases bike to school. But it is much more typical than we would expect. Safe routes to schools as an idea, modern idea, if we can call it that, started in Denmark, in a community named Odense, where I will be later this month, by a school that decided we can change this trend. Let's try a radically new approach. Let's try to get every kid to walk and bike to school. Let's figure out what it takes to do that, even if it means changing our streets, changing our travel patterns, maybe even relocating some of our schools, let's try to get back towards kids walking and biking to school. They had a very successful experiment in Odense. It worked very well. And folks in England got a hold of that idea, and the group Sustrans that we've talked about, led by a guy named Paul Osborne particularly, but many, many others as well, started to popularize the idea along with this national bike route system that they were building. They started plotting where all the schools were along that route system and using the schools as a hook in every community to build the national system from the ground up by making sure that every school would want to connect to it, which meant they could get some new infrastructure, and they had funding allocated for this. And schools that adopted Safe Routes to Schools program policy started getting access to that money, very much as what Melissa was saying earlier. And they began building sort of a grassroots Safe Routes to School movement. At almost the same time, of course, as the internet made the transfer of knowledge and ideas happen much faster after Al Gore invented it in the mid-1990s, several school districts in the United States started to try exactly the same thing. So places like Marin County, California, Arlington, Mass, and Arlington, Virginia, both Arlingtons, Brooklyn, New York, started doing pilot projects of testing this idea. Could we start to move the dime? What would it take in our neighborhoods? And Brooklyn got into a significant effort of traffic calming on Brooklyn streets, particularly in school zones, at a time when traffic calming was just trying to take off. Marin County, California, was so bold as to allocate their state safety program money that they got from the feds based on the number of crashes by mode. Okay, so they looked at their little pie chart and said, well, it turns out that pedestrians and bicyclists, particularly for children, are a much, much higher percentage of traffic injuries, fatalities than any other mode of travel. And it's 28%, or just, I don't know the exact number. More than 20% of our injuries and fatalities are pedestrians and bicyclists. We're going to allocate more than 20% of our federal safety dollars in the state of California to solving that problem. And they put that under the umbrella of Safe Routes to Schools and created initially a $20 million program that's grown to a more than $100 million program because they just simply allocated that money. This was before there was a federal Safe Routes to Schools program at all. So like much federal policy that looks like it comes from Washington, it actually bubbles up and comes from lots of really good local ideas. All of those communities started having very successful outcomes. They did their before and after studies. You were able to see numbers of kids changing their travel behavior, maybe not as significant as what you might have seen in Odense and Denmark, but certainly enough to catch some people's attention. One of those people in particular was Congressman Jim Oberstar from Minnesota, who became very close with a woman named Deb Hubsmith, who ran the Safe Routes to Schools Coalition in Marin County. And they, along with the national coalition, figured out a way to get Safe Routes to Schools into that last transportation bill, into safety, to the tune of about $750 million in Safe Routes to Schools money that became available in the late 1990s. Now, like I said, California was smart enough to already set up a state program, which meant that when you get federal aid, you already had your matching funds in hand. Okay. Now, a lot of Safe Routes to Schools money when it started out was 100%. Applied for Safe Routes to Schools money, you got federal allocation to go do that, and lots of communities did. There are model projects all over the country. One of the most successful movements that I've seen has been Safe Routes to Schools. It is much less under attack right now in Congress, although nothing is safe, I guess. You know, and even some of the people that we're hearing from the Tea Parties would like to get rid of Safe Routes to Schools too, but because it wasn't called a bike and pedestrian program, it kind of has held its own in a bit more of a complete streets way, if you will. Slightly better buzzword that's had less acrimony associated with it. And this is very mom and apple pie. You know, every community's got a Safe Routes to Schools story that needs to happen. And so with that, I'll just tell two quick ones. And I'll start from my childhood, and I'll move to my kids' childhood. I went to high school in New Jersey, in Paramus, which is the poster child for suburbia. If you look up suburbia on Wikipedia, I think it comes right to Paramus, okay? And yet, I witnessed something as a kid that to me, I would love to see. If somebody want to try this, here's your project, okay? Picture of the neighborhood I grew up in. It was Midland Avenue School at the time. And our middle school was called Westbrook Middle School. Paramus had two middle schools, Westbrook and Eastbrook. Westbrook Middle School was located right about at the middle, in between two bigger county roads. Midland Avenue on one side, where the Midland Avenue School was, and Ridgewood Avenue, which went to the town of Ridgewood nearby, both of which went to Route 17, the poster child of suburban highways. And Roosevelt Boulevard connected the two. That was the boulevard that went past Midland Avenue School and connected to our elementary school. In front of the middle school, which is literally right at the middle of this collector, Roosevelt Boulevard, every morning at about 7:30 in the morning, a full-scale railroad mast arm gate came down across Roosevelt Boulevard and prohibited motorists from driving the length of the road. You could drive in from Midland Avenue to the railroad gate. You could drive in from Ridgewood Avenue to the railroad gate, but you could only get as far as the middle school, no farther. Couldn't drive through. That stayed there during the school day. And at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the gate was opened back up so people coming home from work could get in and out of that road. It had the effect of completely, talk about traffic calming, and changing the volume of traffic on that road, both motorized and pedestrian and bike-related traffic, because we didn't have a bike path in our neighborhood. We had Roosevelt Boulevard. We walked and biked right down the middle of the road to the elementary school from the time I was in kindergarten, and safely home for lunch. We often didn't have lunch at school. We went home on our Stingrays and Free Spirits and whatever other kind of bikes we had, all the way through the time I was in middle school. When I was in 9th grade, though, right about when I went to high school, things had started to change enough, and driving had become such an assumption at that point that one of our neighbors led a campaign to get the railroad mast arm taken out. It's actually the house across the street from me that led that campaign, because they didn't have kids, and they wanted to drive everywhere. And they didn't want to think about, neighborhood safety for children. It really didn't matter to them. They led a successful campaign, and I think sometime around 1970, 71, the mast arm gate disappeared for history. If you went back today, literally, to Roosevelt Boulevard, Paramus, went to the Westbrook Middle School, held a Safe Routes to Schools meeting tonight, and asked all the parents what they thought about putting a railroad mast arm gate across Roosevelt Boulevard, I wonder how many seconds it would take for you to get laughed out of town. Then, if you actually had a picture of it, which I really hope someone out there has, and were able to show them that it existed within alumni of that school's lifetime, that not that long ago we thought that way, that we could do something that aggressive, if you will, that progressive, if you will, even in Bergen County, New Jersey, in Paramus, New Jersey, we could have done that. I'm not sure people even believe it, and yet it worked. It worked very, very successfully. We were more physically active. We did walk and bike to school every day. We didn't have to depend upon being driven everywhere we went. We could get to the soccer fields and the town pool, which happened to be behind the middle school, Johnny's Market that was down at the end of the street. It was easier for me in suburban New Jersey to get to Johnny's Market, Johnny's Cash Market, what a landmark that was, next to our elementary school, than it is for my kids in Saratoga Springs today to get across Union Avenue and go to the Spring Street Deli. It was 3 times as far for me to go to Johnny's Market, and I had to walk down the middle of what we would consider a collector suburban street. It just didn't have any cars driving on it because they had the mast arm gate there. That's sort of a example just to show you there are communities making that change now. They are putting in place incredible traffic calming, road diets, streetscape project, pedestrian and bike access, building trails to their schools, doing the education programs that support encouraging kids to walk and bike more, which is critical in terms of safe routes to school, because one of the problems we're suffering from right now, and I see this particularly in my high school age kids, I have 2 daughters in high school, it is, I would say in Saratoga High School right now, far from socially acceptable. It isn't the cool thing by any stretch for kids, especially girls, to bike to school. Walking to school, not so bad. But even that, you get kind of looked at like, well, what's the matter? You never ride? You're not cool enough for somebody to drive you. That social stigma, very similar to what we'd see in countries in China or the developing world where bicycling or walking are seen as second class, is an incredible factor in the decisions that children, students, faculty make in their decision about whether, even if it's perfectly safe to do that, to choose that mode of travel, because it has to be socially acceptable. So Safe Routes to Schools has both an infrastructure side, if you will, but also an encouragement and education side, so that it is clear that the schools are promoting making this change, because it is a change. It's not the way kids have grown up now. Those kids at Westbrook Middle School, and Paramus, and elementary school, by the way, isn't even there anymore. That's another story. They do not see it as socially acceptable or the right thing to do or a good thing to be doing. They're not seeing themselves as environmental heroes if they show up to school on a bike. They're treated like second-class citizens. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the school encourages this, doesn't it? Just put downward pressure on the fact that this is the cool thing to do. I mean, the school, you don't want.
Yeah, something to be said. There's something to be said about kids not perceiving what their schools tell them to do at school. On the other hand, particularly for young kids, you know, for them to feel accepted, embraced, awarded for, maybe by the time you get to high school, you might need to have it be more student-driven. We are seeing all over the country, middle schools and high schools particularly, and a lot of them, having clubs forming around Safe Routes to Schools that are led by the kids. You know, because they've grown up in communities where in grade school they were encouraged. And so Bentonville, Arkansas, where we're working right now, the middle school has a bike racing team.
We can do a triathlon team.
Triathlon teams. These kids have grown, and they're following the trend. Now they're leading. Yeah.
We've got in Glens Falls right now, actually tomorrow, I think, and tomorrow or the day after is
That's right.
Kidder School Day. We've got our school grant is working on a walking school bus program.
Excellent.
Because Glens Falls is still a walking district. So they're getting groups, it acts just like a school bus, but you have usually a parent leading it. And they do the route of a school bus, but they pick up kids along the way, and then all together they walk to school.
In Glens Falls, if I'm not mistaken, there are 2 school districts in the state that still have no buses. And it's Glens Falls and Jamestown, I think, are the 2. You don't have, there's no school buses in Glens Falls still, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's an entire city just north of here, 50,000 people. They have no school buses. They still have their neighborhood schools. They're encouraging Safe Routes to Schools. Another good example, Rochester, New York, has had a Safe Routes to Schools program so long that nobody even knew to call it Safe Routes to Schools. It was started in 1976 by the AAA, another unlikely ally out there, right? A guy by the name of Mike Petramalo, long since retired. Mike decided that this was an important issue in Rochester. They started mapping way before there was GIS with hand-drawn maps, every kid's route to every school in the Rochester School District, and they've continued to do that to this day. Every parent gets a package at the beginning of the school year, every caregiver. They are asked to evaluate their route, to identify signals, crossings, curb ramps, missing sections of sidewalk that they think are critical on those routes, and they have an improvement program to go out and fix it. So can we do this? Absolutely, we can do this. The kind of program Melissa's talking about education and encouragement, particularly for the younger kids. There's a lot of fear, as I mentioned out there. A lot of parents will say, well, we can't let our kids walk or bike to school because they're going to get kidnapped on the way to school. Which, by the way, is less than a 1 in a million thing. Does it ever happen? It happens, okay? But it more often happens from someone who is a child's family member, caregiver, or someone who knows the kid. It's not stranger danger. Most kidnappings, if you follow statistics. Does it happen though? Yes. And tragic when it does, no doubt. But simple things that you can do. The walking school bus or the bike train variation of the same idea. Get a group of kids to meet at what could be a bus stop or the Spring Street Deli or wherever your neighborhood spot is. Meet there at a certain time. And all you need is one adult for a group of kids to be able to do that. It changes those kids' day. I was leading the bike train from my neighborhood the other day. I'll talk about Saratoga in just a minute, with 4 kids. And we're riding on a very wide street where it's perfectly okay to ride side by side. So there's 2 kids in front of me, my son and his friend, and then I'm riding next to a girl named Emily. And beautiful morning, a flock of geese flew over our heads, and the kids, that doesn't happen on a school bus, does it? This massive flock of geese flying over our heads. And then Emily says to me, this is just like driving in a car, except all 4 of us are pedaling. Okay? What more could you want a kid to say at 7:30 in the morning, Genius comment. Absolutely brilliant. But here's what's happening to those kids. Saratoga became sort of a poster child for some of this stuff, maybe inadvertently in the last couple of years, because like many schools across the country, Saratoga Springs had banned kids from biking to school. Hard to believe that, isn't it? Are anybody shocked by that? That kids would be banned? Okay. But school districts in Chicago, Portland, Oregon, all over the country have had to deal with this issue because the adults thought it was unsafe, it was a liability, it was any number of excuses of why we couldn't do it. Because we're not doing it now, we couldn't possibly ever do it, right? We fall into that mentality. That, not looking back, not saying, well, we used to do this all the time, there must be a way to do it right. Instead just saying, no, the way we're doing it now is the only way we can do it. We're sorry, we have to prohibit these kids from doing something that's currently unsafe. I'll try to shorten the story as best I can for the interest of time, but Saratoga's ban went back to the 1990s when a new middle school was built, like I said, a land use decision to locate a middle school outside of the city limits, literally, city line, okay? Schools in the town of Greenfield, the line of the city of Saratoga Springs, because land in Greenfield was cheaper. It turned out that the school is located, if anybody here knows Saratoga, our main street is called Broadway. If you follow Broadway up to its end, it comes to North Broadway. North Broadway is where Skidmore College is located. The college was built on a former estate property called the Glenn Mitchell Estate. The Glenn Mitchell Estate in its heyday included a toboggan slide, there was a resort there was ice skating pond, all kinds of incredible public recreation. There was a horse track up in that area called Woodlawn Oval. Now that's the modern Skidmore College campus. You'll get there on the 20th of October. We can show you all this. And Broadway then, North Broadway ends and becomes a dirt road, which was one of the carriage roads through that old estate. The carriage road goes down, Broadway kind of crests the hill at that point. The carriage road goes back down the hill to the site of the middle school. When the school was built, at the bottom of the carriage road, the trail, people locally call the Glenn Mitchell Trail, at the bottom of the trail was a row of bike racks in front of, behind the school, back of the school. Okay? And I have pictures to prove this, just like the Mascon Gate in New Jersey, the bike racks were full. Kids bike to school. Okay? But when the school opened, the administration wanted to get a traffic light put in, traffic signal in front of the school, which happens to be on New York State Route 9, Maple Avenue in Saratoga. It's called the Maple Avenue School. And the state kept saying that the signal in front of the school doesn't meet the requirements. It isn't warranted, and we can't. You have to pay for that signal. It's the only way you're going to get it. And even then, we're not sure we're going to allow it, because really the only traffic jam on that road is the people coming and going from your school. It's the parents dropping kids off in the morning. It's the buses coming and going. The rest of the day, Maple Avenue is fine. You don't need a traffic signal there. What the school then said was, well, then we've got kids who've got to cross Route 9. If we don't have that signal there, we're not going to allow them to do that. And the only way in New York State to get bus aid, because if you don't allow kids, if you're not going to let kids walk or bike to school, you have to provide buses for them. Follow me. This is, you'll see where I'm going here. There's a section of New York State law, school safety zone law, as it's called, section 131 of the New York State education law, if I have my numbers right. I'll check that for you in a few minutes. It requires you to designate the area around the school a school safety zone, meaning that it is unsafe for kids to walk and bike to the school. A safety zone is the place where it's not safe to walk or ride a bike to school. George Orwell could not have done a better job writing this law. And therefore, you are eligible to get state school bus money for kids who live literally across the street. And then you can get funding to bus them to school. Nothing in that law says, what if you spent that money making it safer? What if you could use that money to put in the signal that you want and the crossings that you need and the infrastructure improvements that would make it safe so it wasn't a, quote, safety zone anymore? Now, there's been people trying to change that law. It will be the next big push after Complete Streets, I hope. There are people starting to, in fact, there's a great report that the American Cancer Society led a task force I was on legislative agenda for New York State to improve public health, and this changing the school safety zone is definitely one of them. You can tell there's going to be staked out opposition to things like this by groups like the bus drivers and the bus companies, because they're getting money to bus people. Could we get them to be walking school bus drivers or bike train conductors? Or Absolutely, you know, we could do that. But the law does not allow you to do that in New York State. So that just sets the stage for this. So George Orwell writes the law, and from about 1994 on, the school then took the bike racks. Once they got the safety zone designation, started getting the bus money for Route 9, which is the front entrance of the school, they forgot completely. The entire community forgot that there's a trail right behind the school. During about the same period of time, mountain biking got really popular. A lot of mountain bikers started using the woods behind Skidmore College because you had this great dirt road that led you in there. The dirt road, by the way, is a city street. It's owned publicly. But all the land on either side of it is owned by the college, and then it becomes school property when you get down the bottom of the hill. A lot of not necessarily the most share the trail-oriented mountain bikers started tearing up the North Woods and Skidmore's campus and drew the negative response of that school's administration. Unfortunately, because back at that point, New York State's mountain bike championships were held in those North Woods. It was a really great event back then. Unfortunately, not everybody wanted to play fair, and people started cutting new single track trails into the Skidmore Woods with nobody's permission to be doing it, literally tearing up the woods, and led by the environmental program at that campus, mountain biking was then banned. Okay, so now mountain biking is banned on the campus. The general public kind of assumed that the trail behind the school is part of the campus, and therefore you should be in there on a mountain bike. Turns out that wasn't entirely true. The school district completely forgot about the trail. And I would say there's probably, in a city of 25,000 people, a couple hundred people that know that trail's even there anymore, let alone that it's the end of our main street. It's not that hard to find, but, and the school district completely turned its back on it. Until just a couple of years ago, a family, the Marinos, who happen to be friends of ours, their son Adam is a diabetic, who has overcome what many people would think would be a very difficult challenge in his life. Is one of the most active kids you'll ever meet. He plays soccer, he's a skier, expert level, loves to ride his bike. On Bike to Work Day a couple years ago, his mom and he decided they would bike downtown where local groups were hosting a little Bike to Work breakfast station. Adam had breakfast there, and then they proceeded to bike to the school. They got to school, locked up his bike. Jeanette's on her way home, and she gets a call from the principal ordering her to come back to the school with a car, pick up her son's bike and her son, and take him home because he's violated the school policy. And they've confiscated his bike, simply for biking to school, unbike to school day. As Melissa said, by the way, this week is National Walk and Bike to School Week, well, International Walk and Bike to School Week. There are places that are trying to encourage this stuff. Bike to Work Day, the same thing. We're trying to nationally encourage people to do that. In Saratoga, the response to that was to punish this kid for having simply biked to school because he violated this policy for the 1990s. I can say this because she's a good friend of mine. Jeanette is of Lebanese, Italian descent and is not somebody to be messed with. She is a force and just somebody who's not going to take that for nothing. I remember when she called me and I said, we knew this was going to happen. We'd all been biking and walking to that school for years. It was a matter of time. And so, all right, here's our teachable moment in this community. What can be done about it? Jeanette chose to start to organize and work with local communities to try to get the school board to change its policy. Adam and his friends somewhat refused to back down. It got front page news coverage. You would think that in a day, if you're principal of that school, what would your response be? Anybody?
Embarrassment.
Embarrassment. What else?
Withdraw the policy.
That day, right? Wouldn't that be the reaction? Look, we're really sorry. We don't even know where this policy came from. Nobody in town can remember it. You know, you're right. Adam